Good morning, everyone. Thank you. Warm welcome and bienvenidos. I'm so happy to see you all here. My name is Dr. Suzanne Rivera, and I'm the president of Macalester College. And even though this is my third year in the job, it's really my first time experiencing this longstanding campus tradition live and in person. So it's really an honor to be a part of this 29th annual International Roundtable with the theme on the impossibilities of decolonizing knowledge and power. To me, a person relatively new to this community, the Roundtable exemplifies some of what I think of as the best aspects of Macalester's spirit. It's a community forum that explores critical and timely issues, linking the local and the global. It reflects and supports Macalester's commitment to social justice. It fosters students' community involvement, and it creates new opportunities to connect learning with action. It also is an incredibly collaborative effort, bringing students, staff, and faculty together to co-create elements of the program. Throughout the next few days, we'll hear the voices of scholars, activists, and artists from the Twin Cities and around the world as we engage in a rigorous exploration of this year's theme. It's a unique opportunity to think about such an issue across disciplines, borders, perspectives, and to understand it in new ways. I want to express gratitude to so many people for their roles in bringing this event from idea to reality. First, I want to thank this year's 4 plenary speakers for the insights they'll share with our community, beginning with this morning's speaker, Dr. Melanie Yazzie from the University of Minnesota, as well as Dr. Marisa Ruiz-Trejo from Universidad Autónoma de Chiapas, Dr. Carol Boyce-Davies from Cornell University, and filmmaker Adam Khalil. I'm also grateful for all the Macalester students who are leading 7 sessions today and tomorrow that seek new ways to challenge narratives and transform the world, and for the faculty and staff members who helped to guide their work. I especially want to thank Professor Joëlle Vitiello of the French and Francophone Studies Department for her leadership, and the members of the advisory committee that she co-chaired this spring with Professor Olga Gonzalez from the Anthropology Department, including Macalester staff, Ebony Aya, Ruth Yanish, Meg Thorson, Professor Ahu Najafian, and students Tamazulu Zulu and Zarin Prussia, In addition, many thanks to Media and Cultural Studies Grants Coordinator Jeremy Meckler and Vice Provost Paul Overvoort for their support. Let's give them all a round of applause, please. Finally, I want to recognize and appreciate those who are supporting this event and its logistics, including the special events team, Bon Appetit for catering today's lunch, the library staff who created the resource guide, and the AV and tech team and facilities staff who set up this space. And thanks to Gabi Estrada from the class of 2021 who created the art for this year's program. Let's give all of them a round of applause too. There's only so much we can cover in 2 days, and we're hoping that these sessions will plant seeds for ongoing reflection, engagement, and action. And yet, even in that short time span, there is so much we can learn from each other, especially through the different lenses and lived experiences we bring to this year's theme. So I hope you all will enjoy and join in the dialogues over these next few days. Thank you so much for being part of these important conversations.
Good morning. Can you hear me okay? All right. So thank you for opening the 2022 International Roundtable, President Rivera. My name is Joëlle Vitiello, and I teach in the Department of French and Francophone Studies, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. I would like us to take a moment to honor the fact that Macalester is on Dakota land. This campus and the surrounding Twin Cities are built upon the ancestral homeland of the Dakota people who were forcibly exiled from the land because of aggressive and persistent settler colonialism. We make this acknowledgement to honor the Dakota, but also the Iowa, Ho-Chunk, and Anishinaabe ancestors, present and future, as well as the land itself. Macalester sits near Bedote, the sacred meeting point of the Mississippi and the Minnesota rivers. In the words of Reverend Jim Bear Jacobs, Bedote is a place of genesis and genocide, both realities being alive in the land at once. Macalester has practiced the land acknowledgement for several years now, thanks to the activism of Indigenous students who developed it along faculty and staff. We recognize that this is not enough and only serves as a first step towards decolonization of academic research and institutional practices. The work of acknowledging this history must be followed by active practices to amplify the voices of indigenous nations and communities. It is our hope that this year's topic and the plenary sessions will open new possibilities to reflect deeply about the places where we stand and think through the next steps in community with all our hearts and minds together. This international roundtable includes 7 student-led sessions and workshops that include guest speakers, activists, scholars, and community members, local and international, and I encourage you all to attend their sessions. They're really spectacular. I feel deeply honored to convene this international roundtable. Since my first year teaching at Macalester College, when I developed a course on literature of decolonization in French, the concept has evolved. Today, the focus is more multidirectional, intersectional, and requires intentional, embodied questioning of the processes of knowledge creation. The films by Adam Khalil that we screened last night, he is one of our plenary speakers, directly address some of the themes that this roundtable encompasses, such as the generational trauma impact of colonial education on First Nations. The first student-led session this morning that was led by Count Huayan and Jessica Nguyen also addressed European and French in particular colonialism and its legacy and post-memory. The recent growth in calls to decolonize frameworks of knowledge affect all disciplines, the decolonization of archives and archival practices, the repatriations of cultural artifacts to formerly colonized territories in Africa and Oceania from European museums, the return of remains of Native Americans and Afro-descendants from scientific academic departments. All these examples point to a critical questioning of modes of knowledge creation. Along with this questioning, this roundtable asks, what does a decolonial education or curriculum look like? We have 4 fantastic plenary speakers who are going to help us imagine decolonial, liberatory practices of learning and teaching and being in this world. The first plenary speaker today is Dr. Melanie Yazzie from the Navajo Nation. She recently joined the Department of American Indian Studies at the University of Minnesota. She is the co-author of Red Nation Rising, From Bordertown Violence to Native Liberation, and of The Red Deal, Indigenous Action to Save the Earth, both from 2021. She also co-hosts the podcast Red Power Hour and serves as lead editor of the open access journal Decolonization. She organizes with the Red Nation, a grassroots native-run organization committed to the liberation of indigenous people from colonialism and capitalism. The title of her talk is We Must Make Kin to Get Free. We will have time for questions after her talk to engage respectfully and with openness about what we will learn from her. So let's give Dr. Yazzie a warm welcome and a warm round of applause.
Okay, can folks hear me? Can all hear me okay? All right. This is a weird mic. Good morning, everyone. Yat Ebene, She'e Melanie Yazzie Nisha. Bilagana Nishle Ma Deshkijni Bashis Chin, Bilagana Dashachero Totsoni Dashanala, Behalge de Nasha Kot Awas Adenenishla. Just introducing myself in my language. I'm a citizen of the Navajo Nation. And actually, I got in at 12:30 this morning on a flight. I had the matriarch of my entire clan, so I just introduced myself. And as Navajo people, we identify ourselves through our matrilineal clans. So I'm white, I'm Scottish and Irish, of Scottish and Irish descent on my mother's side, but on my father's side, our Nullah side, as we say, I'm Ma'ideshkijni, which is Coyote Pass, and then I'm also Totsoni, which is Big Water. Those are my clans. So I was actually just this past week with my Ma'ideshkijni side of my family. Beha'agede de Nasha means I'm from this place. Beha'agede means below the mesa is where my family or where our umbilical cords are buried. It's essentially how we identify where we're from as Diné people. So I was there. I was in Beha'agede. I just got in. Got about 6 hours of sleep to come here this morning because the leading matriarch of my family, she went on in her journey unexpectedly about a week ago. And so the whole family came together this past week. I was not expecting, right, to be traveling, but I'm telling you the story because I think it has everything to do with decolonization, especially as a Diné woman, as an Indigenous person. And what I'm going to talk about today is that essentially, I think of decolonization as a social relation. Decolonization has been written about, and more than being written about, the history. I'm a person who's very interested in histories of decolonization, in the practice, the praxis, and the materiality of what constitutes decolonization. And so I talk a lot about decolonization as a social relation. And of course, in order for a social relation to be a relation, you have to be in relation with other relatives, right? Whether they're human relatives, water relatives, mountain relatives. What constitutes a relative is interspecies, right? It goes beyond the category of the human. And so what I was doing this past week, I think in my mind was an act of decolonization because I was going and traveling quite far to be in relation, right, at a time that's a very sacred time actually for our people. And it was actually a beautiful time to be in relation with my family again, where I'm from, right, where my heart is. So it's actually, even though it's a sad occasion, it's also a moment of how we reenact every time we are in relation with one another, right, this practice of decolonization. I'm going to talk a lot about solidarity and relationality in my talk today. So that's where I'm coming from. And I just wanted to give a disclaimer ahead of time that even though part of me is here, part of me is home in this moment. So I will do my best to be as present as possible. That said, I really want to thank the Kofi Annan Institute for Global Citizenship for organizing this, and especially Dr. Joel Vitiello for your incredible leadership in organizing this. I was saying when I arrived here and was walked over to the Student Center that I actually haven't done one of these presentations since the pandemic started. February of 2020 was the last time I did one of these fancy kind of symposium presentations. And it's really wonderful. It's been so well organized and very welcoming because I'm brand new to the Twin Cities, to Minnesota Makoche. I've only been here for 2.5 months, right? I came from Albuquerque, New Mexico. I was previously in the Native American Studies Department at the University of New Mexico. So I'm brand new. I'm an Indigenous guest on other Indigenous people's homelands. So this has felt really welcoming, actually, and so I deeply appreciate it. It's been very respectful and very welcoming. And my sister actually went to Macalester for 2 years, her first 2 years of undergrad, 20 years ago. So I'm sort of familiar. I went to Grinnell College just down the road in Iowa. So I'm familiar with Macalester's reputation, so I'm just really thrilled to be here. So I'm going to take a drink of water, and then I'll get started. Also, thank you for the warm welcome to Dr. Rivera, the president of Macalester. So, a little bit of context about this piece. This happened 5.5, can you believe? January of 2017, it was almost 6 years. Am I counting right? It was almost 5 years ago. 6 years ago, 5 years ago. This was the beginning of Trump's administration. You remember what was going on in the country at that time? The Women's March was like the largest protest in US history. It has now been surpassed by what popped off here 2.5 years ago. after the murder of George Floyd. And at the time, everyone was it was chaotic. It was very chaotic politically, that historical moment in the US. And so this is a story, and then reflections on kind of the decolonial aspects of the airport protests against the Muslim ban, if you remember this, in the last week of January of 2017. This picture, this is me looking very tired, no sleep. Every time I'm in a picture from a protest, I always look very tired, because I'm always very tired, because they're intense, right? Protests are intense, but I had just taken my first job after my PhD in 2016 at the University of California, Riverside. And so I was also brand new to that area. I had been a longtime organizer with the Red Nation in Albuquerque and other parts of New Mexico, Arizona, and the Navajo Nation where I'm from. And so when all of these things were erupting, the Women's March and the airport protests, I was really eager to kind of get my feet wet with what organizing looked like in Southern California. So this was the first protest I went to. It was at LAX, actually, that week. And it was the largest protest that I'd ever been to. There were about 60 or 70,000 people. Took over, shut down the airport, actually, the day we were there. So this is a reflection on that particular historical moment, and hopefully I can take you back into that as I tell this story. So in this talk, I ask, how can we draw from acts and forms of kinship to strengthen our dreams of being free? Looking at a specific example of Indigenous political intervention that occurred in January 2017 during the airport protests against President Donald Trump's Muslim ban, I explore the political and analytical possibilities of feminist relationality, particularly relations of care, reciprocity, and abundance. These relations of caretaking are at the center of abolitionist and decolonial projects, particularly those espoused by radical Black and Indigenous feminists. I bring Indigenous and Black feminist traditions of relationality together to explore how politicized kinship draws from the decolonial and abolition geographies of these two traditions to chart a different path of relationality, one not overdetermined by the relations of abandonment, harm, and scarcity that drive the carceral regimes of capitalism and colonialism. So, this is a story about kin, not necessarily the kin we are born into, but our chosen kin, the kin we make through political struggle. It is a story that offers a thriving and capacious vision of kin, a story that speaks to the radical power of kinship to inspire our dreams of liberation and guide us to build strong movements for decolonization. I use the term radical in a double sense. I follow Cherokee sociologist Eva Garut's use of the term to highlight how this kin-based relationality is deeply rooted in Indigenous relationships to place, what Mishkogawik geographer Michelle Dago calls geographies of responsibility. I also use the term in the abolitionist and decolonial sense to suggest something creative and future-oriented, the desire to build a world structured by relations of care, love, and abundance, rather than these relations of abandonment, harm, and scarcity. This latter set of relations, right, abandonment, harm, and scarcity, describe our everyday lives under the carceral regimes that make capitalism and settler colonialism possible. Bringing Indigenous and abolitionist traditions, particularly those abolitionist approaches within the Black radical tradition, of relationality together, helps us see the transformative possibilities of politicized kinship and making movements for liberation geographies, those places, formations, and relational structures where all life is dignified, healthy, and thriving. The vision of kin I explore here is neither exclusively about nor for Indigenous peoples, although it does necessarily center us as the peoples who have an original relationship of responsibility with these lands. This vision of which I speak is, however, articulated through Indigenous acts of making kin, premised on alternative ways of knowing and being that aspire to material and lived change, which geographers Sarah DeLu and Sarah Hunt argue is a key element of decolonizing geographic practice. Although for my own people, the Diné, kinship making is an act that encompasses all relatives, like water, mountains, animals, and ancestors, here I want to focus on how we make kin with each other as five-fingered beings, as human beings. In this essay, this talk, I ask, How can we draw from acts and forms of kinship to strengthen our dreams of being free? So I'm going to talk a bit more about this right here. So hashtag no ban on stolen land began days after Donald Trump's presidential inauguration in January of 2017. On January 27th of that year, Trump signed an executive order halting all refugee admissions and temporarily barring people from 7 Muslim-majority countries. This quickly became known as the Muslim ban. Like millions across the world, I was outraged by this news. On the evening of January 28th, when the first airport protest against the ban erupted at JFK Airport in New York City, I had taken to Facebook and Twitter to find community and share my outrage. As I was scrolling through posts and tweets, I came across a live stream of the JFK protest. I was stunned by what I saw. Thousands of people, tens of thousands of people, were flooding one of the busiest airports in the world, chanting and rejecting the carceral state of detention, surveillance, and fear that US airports had become in the name of homeland security following 9/11. Instead of obedience, people were fearlessly reclaiming airports to resist Islamophobia and US imperialism. The JFK airport, like it did for many, sparked me into action. I had experience organizing direct actions like protests and street demonstrations. In fact, the grassroots Indigenous liberation organization I work with, the Red Nation, had been running a series for months. We had been running a series of solidarity demonstrations in Albuquerque, New Mexico, to support the efforts of water protectors at Standing Rock, who were still camped alongside the Cannonball River when the Muslim ban went into effect. Having relocated to San Bernardino, California from Albuquerque just a few months prior, I was a little unsure, however, of where to start with organizing a protest in my new region. I began reaching out to people I knew in the area to hatch a plan, and I soon learned that a Facebook event had been created by a Los Angeles-based group inviting people to descend upon LAX on the afternoon of January 30th to protest the ban. My then partner and I began to prepare. This is us together. All our protest gear was still in Albuquerque with our Red Nation comrades, so we improvised. I rummaged through dozens of moving boxes I had tossed in the garage, picking out 2 large ones and dragging them onto our new back porch. I went into our semi-unpacked home office and tore through several boxes to find my art supplies. I came charging out of the office, brandishing 2 brushes and some half-dried red acrylic paint. Breathless from the effort and excited for the protest, my partner and I cut the boxes open, sat down on the concrete, and painted 2 signs to bring with us to the LAX protest. One read, "No ban on stolen land," and the other read, "Refugees welcome on native land." We had been discussing what to put on the signs the previous night. Social media was filled with footage of people at airports across the country protesting the ban, but something weird and troubling was unfolding. Protesters were singing Woody Guthrie's "This Land Is Your Land," proudly waving American flags, and holding signs saying, "This land was made for you and me, and we are all immigrants." It seemed like there was a whole lot of white settler nationalism going on at these protests. Since I was already glued to social media, I wanted to see what my Indigenous friends were saying about this, and if they shared my growing disgust for what was unfolding. Why disgust? Here were people invoking the settler colonial logic of manifest destiny, which historian Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz calls a mythology embedded in the minds of nearly everyone in the United States and around the world. This mythology, she points out, promotes the inevitability of US extent and power, its destiny, with an implication that the continent had previously been terra nullius, a land without people. Put another way, manifest destiny posits that the United States is a land in need of settlement by a nation of immigrants, to be claimed from sea to shining sea as the land of their birthright. As an Indigenous historian with knowledge of US history, I was deeply troubled by this. I had read Dunbar-Ortiz's groundbreaking book, An Indigenous People's History of the United States, the year prior. The central argument of that book was on repeat in my mind. Manifest destiny is meant to obscure the fact that the very existence of the country is a result of the looting of an entire continent and the genociding of an entire people. The turn of events unfolding at the airport protests was even more disturbing because it was happening simultaneous to a harrowing struggle for Indigenous liberation from US settler colonialism that had been well covered in mainstream media for months prior to the ban. I'm talking about the No Dapple uprising at Standing Rock. I remember throwing my hands up and yelling at my laptop screen, "Have you people learned nothing from No Dapple?" I actually did that. I do that a lot. In my frantic searching on Facebook, I came across a thread on my colleague and friend Jody Bird's page. The thread offered a similar critique of the protests. I noticed that Bird, a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation and a leading thinker in US-based Indigenous studies, had a hashtag on their post, #NoBanOnStolenLand. I was stunned by the phrase. Like all good political slogans or viral-worthy hashtags, it was simple but powerful, perfectly expressing my own thoughts about the manifest destiny being deployed in the protests. I was heartened to learn that the phrase "no ban on stolen land" was actually coined by a non-Indigenous scholar, Laura Sachiko Fujikawa, who is an assistant professor of American Studies and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at Colby College. I realized the message about politicized relationality and kinship, so clearly displayed in the hashtag, seemed to me deeply rooted not only in Indigenous critiques of settler colonialism, but also in anti-racist and queer feminist politics. It was a refreshing expression of solidarity with the Muslim community that did not erase Indigenous people. Given what was unfolding on the ground at the protests, I felt it was important to take the message of no ban on stolen land off of Facebook and into the streets. My partner and I finished the signs, threw them in our car, and drove through Southern California traffic. If you're familiar, you'll know what that's like. It took us 3 hours to get there, to LAX, even though we live 50 miles away, and drove through Southern California traffic to LAX to join the tens of thousands of people already gathered at the international terminal. We spent the entire afternoon at the protest, and after another grueling drive home, I took to Facebook to reflect upon what we had experienced there. Facebook was like a bigger thing in 2017 than it is now. People still looked at Facebook for political commentary, not just Twitter and Instagram. So I know this dates me, but this is what I wrote. Today, at the hashtag LAX protest, Native people conducted a welcoming ceremony for our Muslim and refugee sisters. We danced a long round dance to the beat of the drum. At one point during the dance, thousands and thousands of people erupted in cheer. The noise was so thunderous that it shook the ground. It literally shook the airport. That's how thunderous it was. And it went on and on, because there was 60, 70,000 people, so it just rippled through the crowd. It was like a concert, basically. In that moment, I closed my eyes and could feel the crowd and the earth pulsating. Our circle became the beating heart of the crowd right then. And minutes later, a small group of no more than a dozen Native people took charge of the whole protest and marched. We marched all the way around LAX. Everyone followed. We all moved as one. And for that period of time, Native people were at the front. We were the tip of the spear. When one of our Native brothers took to the megaphone and said that the United States has no authority on Native land, the crowd actually cheered. It was so loud my ears were ringing. And this is what I witnessed today. This is the power of Native-led movements. We never stopped practicing our own customs of kinship making, citizenship, and belonging. Trump and all US forms of citizenship and law are illegitimate on stolen land. So when we say, as Native people, right, Muslims and refugees are welcome on Native land, I swore here, we effing mean it. Hashtag no ban on stolen land, hashtag ban USA. So within 3 hours, the post and the picture that accompanied it, which is this photo here, my friend Mashana Goman, who's also a prominent scholar in Native studies, who's Haudenosaunee feminist, this post and this picture and the post I just read went viral, actually. On Facebook alone, both were shared over 15,000 times within the first hour. It had turned into many more by the next day. Memes with the hashtag were cropping up all over Twitter and Instagram. And a new plural version of the hashtag no bans on stolen lands emerged the next day, and that also quickly went viral. Messages from across the world flooded my Facebook and Twitter accounts. One writer from Iran admitted that he believed the age-old settler narrative that Native people were extinct in the United States, and was so astonished by the Indigenous welcoming ceremony we performed at the protest that he wept. He wrote this to me. My favorite moments in organizing work happen when these profound and organic forms of connection and solidarity are forged. However, it is crucial to remember that solidarity is political, and as such requires accountability to a political project, or as feminist geographers Pamela Moss and Avril Madrell argue, must go beyond personal levels of comfort and move into spaces full of trepidation, so as not to let rallying cries eradicate difference, which is a phenomenon they had witnessed at the historic Women's March, which itself transpired mere days before the airport protests erupted. In this case, my political project was to wield no ban on stolen land as an Indigenous and a decolonial intervention into the narrative of manifest destiny dominating the protests. But my intention was not merely to be disruptive, but rather to introduce a disagreement that might push protesters towards a more accountable and intersectional politics, or as Cindy Ann Rose Woodward and Reuben Rose Redwood put it, provide a space where disagreements can be engaged productively rather than dismissed as too divisive, which happens a lot in the movement. In other words, bringing no ban on stolen land into a live space of solidarity that was forming and shifting in action as the airport protests unfolded. It was an embodied practice, right? It was an embodied practice of decolonization that was meant to both strengthen the solidarity efforts underway, but also model responsible relations with Indigenous peoples, right? In addition to taking an emphatic and principled stance against Islamophobia. However, as my post and photo kept circulating the following day and accumulating several thousands more comments and likes, I noticed a trend that started to concern me again. People were clearly moved by the expression of solidarity and gesture of Indigenous hospitality. Many were calling it a form of love. This was a word that was being used a lot. And actually, the phrase decolonial love is probably a pretty common phrase when we're talking about decolonization. So people were clearly moved by the expression of solidarity and the gesture of Indigenous hospitality, but the anti-colonial critique seemed a lot less popular, or at least not landing with quite the same impact. So I wrote this on Instagram instead of Facebook to clarify my previous post. Thanks for all the comments, everyone. This is the thing. This is an act of solidarity, but remember, Native people have real political authority. Many of us don't care whether or not the US recognizes this authority. We still practice it. This is Native land. We do not fear the illegitimate US government. Many of us do not participate in the rabid forms of racism and violence that the US perpetrates against other peoples of the world. Many of us do, but many of us don't. We are with you, and we are ready to fight. The US has never eliminated us, no matter how hard it tries. Wherever you are across the world, know that our political traditions of resistance are as strong as our will to thrive and enact our own laws as Native people of this land. This is the story of our ascension. Keep rising, relatives, keep rising. Although for others it may be different, for me, the point of no ban on stolen land at LAX was not only to extend an act of radical love to others across the globe, but also, of course, to remind people that Indigenous traditions of nationhood, citizenship, and belonging never went away. I wanted to emphasize that our practices of making kin, of making relatives, and of claiming relatives were and are the origins of these traditions. In other words, no ban on stolen land was meant to invite people to imagine collective forms of belonging and citizenship beyond the institutions of racialized exclusion that give shape to US nationalism, and more directly, to encourage people to draw specifically from indigenous traditions of belonging as an explicitly anti-colonial act. In so doing, no ban on stolen land articulates a type of relationality that does not reproduce forms of collective belonging that depend upon racism and Indigenous dispossession and erasure. With its emphasis on Indigenous kinship, No ban on stolen land also disrupted and unsettled normative settler assumptions about what constitutes solidarity, or love for that matter, on stolen land. That feel-good, radical love, or that good feeling reconciliation, as many Indigenous people call it, that so many of those protesters praised while completely missing the point about intersectional accountability to Indigenous liberation and self-determination. So, I'm gonna pivot a little bit here. I'm gonna talk a little bit more about kinship, caretaking, and abolition. For Diné, Navajo people, our traditions and practices of making kin are about inviting new relatives into our networks of relationality. They are about enlivening and celebrating our future as a growing, vibrant people who caretake, reciprocate, and hold an ethics of deep accountability with one another. These aren't the same forms of belonging like the criteria that currently determine tribal membership, and blood quantum specifically comes to mind. In my mind, customary forms of kinship are the opposite of colonially imposed criteria like blood quantum or racialized exclusion that underwrites pretty much all forms of US citizenship. Rather than exclusionary, they are inclusive. Rather than fractionating us into disappearance, they are expansive and future-oriented. Rather than rigid, they are fluid. Rather than static, they are dynamic. But these forms and practices of kinship do not happen in a vacuum. They are informed by our colonial present, a present that is saturated with the violence of racism, enclosure, resource extraction, and policing. In this context, love isn't just about treating someone or something well. It's certainly not just about feeling good. The imbalance of power between Indigenous people and mainstream settler society must be acknowledged, and Indigenous self-determination and land stewardship upheld if love is to have any political or historical teeth. When you enter into relationship, there is an expectation. What is this expectation? For me, it is an expectation simply to be a good relative and to treat each other well, to be responsible, reciprocal, respectful, and accountable. And in the realm of political struggle, it is also an expectation to defend, protect, and grow hard-fought struggles for liberation and decolonization from the violence of white supremacy, settler colonialism, imperialism, and heteropatriarchy. The response to no ban on stolen land didn't come only from witnessing unlikely kinship and the form of Indigenous love and solidarity for refugees and our Muslim relatives. It came from the rebellious and defiant push, I call it the anti-colonial middle finger, behind these acts of kinship, as well as an unapologetic affirmation of Indigenous presence and futurity. Although temporary, the moments in which these politicized forms of kinship, these honest and intersectional modes of solidarity, coalesce are the moments when we are at our strongest in the movement. They are the moments when we remember our power and our collective capacity for freedom. So I want to end with a final story. At the invitation of Laurel May Singh, an assistant professor of ethnic studies at the University of Hawaii, Manoa, and a brilliant abolitionist, in November 2019, I participated in a community panel in Honolulu, Hawaii called Abolition and Abundance, Living Beyond Punishment. The panel included many fierce relatives whose words and compassion transformed my politics and touched my heart. Prior to the panel, I had, of course, read work by prominent abolitionists like Angela Davis, Dylan Rodriguez, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Ruth Wilson Gilmore. But I didn't consider the work I do abolitionist. Decolonial, yes, but not abolitionist. I also didn't know much about, honestly, about abolition at the time in relation to Indigenous politics. It was a revelation after the panel to realize that my work on radical relationality and politicized kinship is in fact also deeply abolitionist. During the panel, Diné Dozier, a Black queer feminist with longstanding commitments to abolition work in Los Angeles, California, reminded us that building kinship and community is an abolitionist practice because it emphasizes caretaking and love instead of harm and punishment. For the Red Nation, right, the organization I organize with, caretaking is one of the central modes of relationality we employ in our political work. We are part of a vibrant tradition of Indigenous caretakers. Caretaking has inspired Indigenous people over the last decade to rise up against resource extraction and state violence. Every time a Kanaka or Native Hawaiian relative has put their body on the line to protect Mauna Kea, they have been taking care of their relative, the mountain. Every time a water protector laid down a prayer at the Cannonball River at Standing Rock, they were taking care of their relative, the water. Every time a tribal leader signed their name to a council resolution proclaiming the protection of a sacred site like Bears Ears, they were caretaking their ancestors. This caretaking of relations, human and otherwise, is at the heart of Indigenous movements for decolonization. Because of Dozier's powerful words, I now realize that caretaking is also an abolitionist practice, and it's been written about quite widely by Black feminists who do work on abolition. And that Indigenous people today are fighting for an abolitionist as well as a decolonial future, because our lives, the water, the land, all of our relatives are so profoundly unfree, we must make kin to get free. What this means for the movement more broadly is that caretaking must be at the center of our collective efforts to build a future on a planet that is on the precipice of ruin. We must continue to develop caretaking economies, caretaking ecologies, and caretaking geographies to restore the health of our land and water relatives and ultimately stand for life. Moments like No Ban on Stolen Land start this work, as do countless other moments created by millions of people across the world. But we need to take it up a notch and fast. Our future urgently depends upon it. So this is the end of that piece. And I want to talk just a bit about some of my other work in regard to caretaking as really central to decolonization, right? The practice, the materiality of decolonization. Really quickly before I go there, part of the reason, and I've started to do more work on this as well, it's a chapter in my new book, thinking about the relationship from an Indigenous feminist perspective of decolonization, which has often been an analog for Indigenous struggles, and then abolition is often an analog for Black liberation struggles. And so I've been trying to think about decolonization and abolition within the same frame, because I think Black and Indigenous solidarity is absolutely essential for liberation here in Turtle Island. There's a lot of conversations, a lot of tensions in the movement around this particular axis of solidarity. And I think it's just critically important for us to be thinking about them and putting them into conversation, however uncomfortable that conversation might be. Not to collapse them, right? But to put them into conversation in a very productive way, since we're under the ticking time bomb of climate change. And our liberation struggles, I think, really depend upon us being able to work together and to cooperate, right, on a much larger scale than perhaps we've ever done before, or that perhaps we're comfortable doing, I think, to really, have a future as a species, or that all of our relatives are able to have a future. And so I was beginning to do that work in the piece that I just read. I wrote it about 3 years ago. It just got published like 2 months ago, which tells you the timeline of academic publishing. But I've written elsewhere about, thinking about carcerality, right? Abolition addresses carcerality, all regimes of carcerality. And then if we're thinking about relationality and caretaking, the politics of caretaking and the act of caretaking at the center of decolonization, the caretaking, of course, like I say, extends beyond just human-to-human caretaking. It's the caretaking of all of one's relations, the past to the future. The future is a relation, right? This notion of the 7 generations, how we are accountable to people we will never know, and ensuring that we're creating a home, right, and a life that will still be thriving and beautiful for the 7 generations from now, that we will never see. We will be ancestors, right, to those generations. So the notion of caretaking and relationality is incredibly expansive. It's almost like a universe, multifaceted kind of notion of caretaking and relationality. And so if we're thinking about carcerality as something that is not just related to the category of the human, the caging and the warehousing of human beings and bodies, but also borders, right? The advent of private property, the transfer of Indigenous land stewardship, a certain kind of land tenure that was not about possession, right? It was something that might be considered part of the commons. And then the land being stolen, and liquidated through multiple mechanisms in the history of the United States. it gets transferred into these things, these chunks that then become private property, that then you can possess, right? And so this wasn't just happenstance, that it just happened by miracle. There's an entire system that's structured on the privatization of land. The very notion of owning land, right, is first of all the building block of capitalism, but it's also the building block of settler societies, really, because settler colonialism is all about land and how wealth is embedded in land ownership. The land itself is the major source of wealth in the United States. 80% of all private landowners are white men in the United States, if you didn't know that, right? So there's a statistic to give you a correlation. And so if we're thinking about carcerality, right, we're thinking about literally the caging of the land itself with borders. The creation of private property is itself a type of carcerality. And if we see the land or the damming of a river, right, as a type of carcerality, or preventing relatives like buffalo or elk or other animal relatives from being able to move and flow freely, including human beings be able to move and flow freely the way that we are supposed to, especially indigenous people of this continent, that the prevention of that, the putting up of borders, fences, gates, right, the creation of nation states is itself a type of carcerality that doesn't just affect human beings, right, but it's a type of carcerality and encaging, enclosure. It encloses our other than human relatives. And so if we're thinking about abolition kind of in the register of this kind of relationality and caretaking, then I think we also need to be thinking about borders, right? We need to be thinking about the type of enclosure and the type of caging that affects the movement and the fluidity of all life on this planet, not just human life. And so I've kind of taken some of what I've written here and what I just read, and I've taken it into some of those other areas, so I just wanted to provide a comment on that. And finally, I've also written elsewhere, I'm the lead editor of the Decolonization Journal, which unfortunately has been defunct for a couple of years because I've been too busy with other things, but we'll be publishing a new issue soon. But the last journal issue I helped to co-edit and bring together was about water, the politics of water. Of course, the title of the journal is Decolonization, so the entire issue was 10 different pieces, as well as the introduction I co-wrote with my colleague Kutcher Risling-Baldy, was about decolonization in relationship to water. And in that piece, I was really thinking through what does relationality have to do when it comes to water and decolonization? And Kutcher, she said something really profound. She's like, well, water helps us to think in a decolonial way. How do we think like water? How do we act like water? And she wrote this in that piece. And you know, we were writing this and bringing this issue together right as Standing Rock was coming to an end in the spring of 2017, and the police were clearing out the camps and evicting people. And that particular uprising, very important moment in the history, by the way, of Indigenous liberation in the so-called United States. But that moment showed me something, and it was that we as human beings did not come together to come back into right relation with each other and to caretake each other on our own accord. The water actually brought us back together. It was the water nation, our water relatives, called upon us to get our act together, right? To come back together in a really large way and engage in solidarity so as to protect the water, to protect our water relatives. And then in the course of doing that and learning from what the water was telling us, we came back into relation with each other, I think in a really powerful way. And so that particular that uprising, that moment in history really taught me what it means to think like water, and that the water teaches us to be good relatives, right? And that in caretaking the water, we learn a lot about how we caretake each other, and then that becomes the basis for how we go about this project, really, this very messy, both big and small project of decolonization. And so when I think about decolonization as a social relation, that's what I mean. It's that relationality that isn't just human to human, but sometimes the things that are taught to us by our other than human relatives. And that the solidarity, right, of this moment here at the airport protests, there's a lot about decolonization that's about how we do it in kind of an individual, like the inner landscape of who we are, decolonizing our minds, I imagine like the notions of like decolonizing education and curriculum can sometimes feel a bit like, how are we decolonizing ourselves? And I'm more interested in how we do that work together, outside of ourselves, in a very collective, in a very generous, and a very capacious kind of manner. Because if you're talking about movements, I do a lot of work in the movement. People call it the movement. Really, the movement is just people, a lot of people who come from very different backgrounds trying to figure out how to work together. It is quite literally a social relation, a highly imperfect, completely filled with conflict social relation. But nevertheless, if you don't show up for the social relation, you don't learn how to get free, because the only way you get free is with other people, which is a rub, like that's hard to think that you have to be in relation with all of these other people who you don't know really, and you may not agree with in order to get free. But at least from where I stand and from what I've learned, after a decade of doing academic work as well as on the ground organizing, that's about it. That's the starting point for all of the other sophisticated analysis and theory. It's really, what do they say, like 50% of success is showing up? I'd say 50% of movement work is literally you just have to show up and be in relation with other people. And that's not terribly sophisticated or exciting to say, but that's probably the starting point for decolonization. So thank you. Thank you for listening to me this morning and everyone for coming out. I really look forward to the Q&A. Tell me all the things, and I especially look forward to hearing from students. Thank you so much, everyone. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Please bring your questions. There are 2 microphones there, and you can start coming to...
Don't be afraid.
You give us a lot to think about.
Sure. Even if it isn't an incomplete thought, please share it. If it's an emotional response, please share it.
Maybe I can formulate a question.
Sounds good.
Here, so you can hear me. Is this on?
I don't think so.
Okay. Can you just tell us if you think that since May 2020, you are more hopeful for this kind of dialogues and solidarity movement? Or do you see the same critics,
Yeah.
critical
Yeah.
issues coming up from the No Ban on Stolen Land movement?
I knew I was going to get the question. So obviously, right, Oh, you had a hard time hearing the question? So do you want to speak at, I don't know if I'm going to paraphrase this correctly. It's a question about my reflections on if we've made headway in terms of, acknowledging this type of critique that I was making through the No Ban on Stolen Land post-May 2020, the uprising that started in Minneapolis. Or if I see that things have changed, or maybe if they're the same. Is that the gist of your question, yes. Joelle? Okay. Okay, did everyone hear that? This is complicated. I've been as in a lot of American cities, I was in Albuquerque at the time. We were very active that summer, from about May until October of 2020, with what was happening in the Southwest around, pertaining to the conversation about racism, really. Anti-Black racism and solidarity with Black Lives Matter and what was unfolding, particularly here and in other places in the country. But frankly, the Red Nation was the largest organization, radical organization at the time in the entire region. And it's just bunch of indigenous people, led primarily by indigenous women and LGBTQ2 youth. And so we were very prominent in every single protest, and everything that happened during that summer. And it was a very unique moment, that span of time between May and then basically the presidential election of Joe Biden in November of 2020. It was a remarkable moment of real solidarity, I would say. But the reason why it was a remarkable moment of the kind of solidarity that I was hoping for, but maybe didn't quite see in this moment, 2.5, 3.5 years earlier, was because it was a very dangerous moment. There were organized white supremacist militias in New Mexico, as there were in other places in the United States. And our lives depended upon every time we went out onto the streets, or we were out trying to support the community, even doing mutual aid, right? Because mutual aid really exploded during that summer, but of course, because of the pandemic, mutual aid became this thing that people were talking about, even though it's part of like the anarchist tradition, and no one had ever really talked about mutual aid outside of those political communities prior to that. But there was a real commitment to caretaking across difference and relating in solidarity across difference. And it was remarkable in those moments where you were on front lines, you were facing people with a lot of guns. The police in Albuquerque are also notoriously violent. They murder people at higher rates than most other cities, maybe except Minneapolis. So I came from a city where in 2013 and 2014, for example, there was a vibrant anti-police violence movement because the police were killing people at a higher rate per capita than any other city in the US. So not only were these vigilantes, these like settler citizen militias essentially, many of whom were neo-Nazis and proud out neo-Nazis, were we having to come up against them on the streets when we were doing solidarity actions with Black Lives Matter, but the police, were also calling them armed friendlies, and so it was basically just like cops everywhere, essentially, whether they had badges or not, heavily armed, really out for blood. That was a summer where I'm sure the feeling here was something very similar. We can't underestimate how terrifying that summer was, I think, into the fall. And I don't know if it was just the extreme context of that, having to face a well-recognized enemy, essentially, that brought us together. I'm sure that had something to do with it. But watching the 3rd Precinct burn and really being like, wow, someone actually did it. And we all think about it a lot because the repression is so intense, right? And the amount of death is just so constant, the violence is so constant, that seeing people do that here ignited in millions of us around the country and the world, like, it sprung us into action. And that right there, that's because it became the largest protest movement in US history. And the reason why that happened is because of solidarity. I think it's because of this commitment to relationality, and really putting yourself on the line, even for kin who aren't your own kin, right? But it was that politicized kinship. It was this notion that, like, yes, I'm gonna go out on the streets tonight to protect these young Black Lives Matter organizers in a place like Albuquerque who are facing off with armed white supremacists and police, right? We didn't have to do that, but we did that, not really out of sense of obligation, but because we understood from our hearts, right? That this is what solidarity looks like. You know how we chant in the streets sometimes, we're like, this is what solidarity looks like, and those types of things. I mean, it really took the slogans that we had been saying maybe in some of the previous years of organizing, and it really tested our ability to be in solidarity. That being the case, I think historically, the solidarity and the relationality, the more I think about it, sometimes it happens in moments or flashes. Sometimes those last for hours, sometimes they last for days, sometimes they last for weeks. But sustaining it across a longer period of time with social movements and political struggle is much harder. The institutions of liberalism and co-optation make it very difficult. There is an active effort to gut the movements, and there's fatigue. That solidarity takes a lot out of you. After Standing Rock, there was so much fatigue because that solidarity took a lot out of people. And so here we are about 2 years, little under 2.5 years later, and I think that there is incredible fatigue in the movement, in total honesty. Now, and a lot of organizations that were very active in that summer no longer exist. Or a lot of those movements or those community, collectives no longer exist. And the Red Nation went through its own really difficult period in early 2021 into the latter part of that year, and we almost just threw in the towel. And we're like a very solid, we've been around for 8 years, have really good political education and development in our cadre. And so I think for us, it's been a very trying time, and I imagine it's been very trying for pretty much everybody else. Of course, there's something called the pandemic, that's also been going on. And so I think we're just in a moment as like human beings where everything feels, I was telling Jeremy this earlier, 3 times harder. Just to live on a daily basis is really hard, right? And then to relate to other people and to actually be back in person, first of all, has also not happened really over the last 2 years. And then this thing where you have to show up and be in relation and work through difference. Things are very polarized, even within the movement, not just in the US. Fascism is actually a thing that we're still confronting, and it's very terrifying for people. And so there's just this confluence of things in this historical moment that I think make the movement, I'm not really sure, total honesty, I'm not really sure how well we're doing at the solidarity and the relationality right now. But I don't know, something else could light on fire and then millions of us could get back out there. And that's also what I've learned. Sometimes when you're at your lowest point, something will happen. And you're like, whoa, like the people are rising. We got to go out there and rise with the people, And for however long this goes, this fire burns in this particular uprising or this moment, we're going to be right there in it so that we can push this as far forward as we possibly can, because we know there's going to be rest and there's going to be a down moment again. And I just think we're in like a down moment and a moment of rest, which is okay. It's okay to have the dialectical relationship between being insanely active and then also being able to rest and, I don't know, get our business in order, I think, essentially within the movement, so that we're prepared. I think that's the feeling. We're all trying to prepare for what's next, because it's like you can feel it. Sometimes it feels like impending doom, but mostly, I don't know. I think some major things are going to keep happening, and so we have to be here for it. You just can't be worn out all the time. Yeah. That was a very imperfect answer, but that's just trying to read the material conditions. Hi. I don't think it's on.
I'll try and speak loud.
Project? Okay.
To everybody. Thanks so much.
Yeah.
I'm a huge fan.
Oh.
Read of yours, so I'm excited
Thanks.
to see you here. Sorry. I'm Brian Lozetsky. I teach and ed studies here, so I'm
Great.
not a student. Michelle, can I look?
Yes. Yes.
I wanted to kind of build on your last point around the challenges of the politics of solidarity.
Sure.
A few years back, I had a brief exchange with Eve Tuck,
Okay.
and it was interesting because you have the no ban on stolen land. Okay. Hello. I heard it when it was in your hand.
Oh, yeah, it's on. Okay.
So I had a brief exchange with Eve Tuck a few years ago, and the no ban on stolen land sign reminded me. But she said there's also no. She said there can't be civil rights on stolen land.
Interesting.
And
okay.
so that there was this, and it was a contestation of like the politics of the Black civil rights movement with indigenous sovereignty.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess I'm wondering and thinking about that as part of the complexities of solidarity, like
Sure.
the theories of change that people are bringing to these spaces. So, the tens of thousands of, and you spoke to it in your talk, right? The tens of thousands of people who came to march at the airport, not everyone was there for like decolonization, right?
No.
Some people were there because they want to like appeal to the very
Sure.
metrics of the nation state and
Sure.
citizenship status and home ownership and all, right?
Sure.
And so I guess the question that or not even a question, I just want to hear you say a little bit more about the challenges of that, because I find that that's something that's also part of the problem of this effort towards solidarity is we don't have clear language on what, and I think BIPOC and like language around that kind of like masks a lot of times what it is we're supposed to be fighting for, and it gets put under a banner of like naming. I'll stop there.
Whew. That's all the things. Thank you for the reflection. Listen, I'm talking about kinship and relationality in this piece, and then we had a lot of non-Native people join. The Red Nation had a huge uptick in new membership over the pandemic, the majority of those people were not Indigenous. And the Indigenous people who had held it down for several years prior to that, we had a specific understanding of what Indigenous liberation looked like, and we were Indigenous. It turned out that a lot of the non-Native people, even people of color who had joined the organization, were not down for Indigenous liberation. And they actually really didn't understand the history. And so we had this huge blow up in the organization. We almost quit, like people like hurt each other. Half the membership left the organization last year in 2021. And it was over the way that people were interpreting solidarity and kinship and relationality. And for a lot of Native people, I use Native and Indigenous usually interchangeably. Like myself, I know what kinship means as a Diné person. Like I understand specifically what kinship is supposed to mean and to look like. But there was this introduction of like a queer liberal kind of kinship where it's like, and this was mostly coming from kind of like white folks who came from that political tradition who had joined the organization. And it's fine, we're not an identity-based organization. We're just like, if you're down for Indigenous liberation, you can totally join this organization, the Red Nation. And we were interested in growing it at the time. But the type of kinship was about something fundamentally different and kind of offensive and insulting, actually, to the very grounded Indigenous notions of kinship. And so this was the primary sticking point within our organization. And so at the time, I was really grooving, I was vibing with like kinship and relationality. And then that happened, and I was like, oh God, these people who are like supposed to be my comrades in struggle, they actually don't know what I'm talking about. And we spent a lot of time together. These are people who've been in my home, right? These are people I've invited into like Indigenous ceremonial spaces. And so I was kind of like, I halted with the solidarity stuff at that time. It really gave me a run for my money in terms of what I'm talking about here and whether or not I actually believed that it was possible. This relates back to your question as well. And so all I'm saying from that reflection is that it's, again, right? Struggle is not just a word that we use and we project onto movements. Struggle's a real thing, right? Being a social relation, being in relation is a struggle. And you make decisions when you struggle through something, and then sometimes that'll take you like linearly to a place where you feel like you're more developed, but mostly struggle is just something that keeps happening over and over and over again, I guess and that's like not a very fun thing to think about, but I think that is the reality. And so solidarity is this thing that has to happen through struggle, and you have to keep struggling, like constantly. I think actually, to what do like Marxists or like people who are kind of revolutionaries have taught me of elders kind of in the movement that. What do they say? Sometimes you suspend the contradiction to catapult forward, but sometimes you have to engage the contradiction. And it's hard to gauge when you do that because solidarity is ultimately a contradiction, right? These contradictions, civil rights and sovereignty, there are contradictions there. And so when do you engage that? How do you engage it? What's the goal? Do you just break down and never speak to each other again, right? Or do you figure out a path forward that's very honest but very accountable, but that may take way longer than you want it to, or it may not lead to the place where you thought it was going to lead, and it breaks your heart, right? And so it's just I take it one day at a time. I don't have perfect frameworks or perfect ideas because I understand that you only really, make the history, the stuff of the movement itself through struggle, and struggle is a very alive, very active thing that again isn't teleological, it's dialectical. It doesn't lead you always to the place where you think it. Even this notion of liberation, it's not like an end point for me, or decolonization isn't this end point. It can't be just because I know what struggle is like. So that's my reflection on that. Things like BIPOC and the words we use and the shorthands. Sometimes I feel that's very like social media influenced. And I have a lot of critiques of social media-based organizing because I think sometimes it skews expectations and it makes it harder sometimes for us to be in relation, like active relation, when we're using shorthands and tweets. And also we destroy and attack each other a lot. actually on social media, and that to me seems like maybe like not my first impulse as a type of relation, when I'm especially trying to relate to other people who are struggling for something that might be similar to what I'm struggling for. My impulse is always to like work through the difference. Sometimes you come to an impasse and that's just the way it is. But yeah, my first impulse isn't to like dogpile that person on Twitter. And I think that that's a very common thing to do. And so the shorthands end up standing in for the substance, and then the shorthands sometimes distort, I think, expectations, but also the real difficult work of being in relation with people. But I understand also why that exists. So another imperfect answer, but very materialist answer. That's interesting that Eve Tuck said that civil rights is not compatible with Indigenous. I'm going to give that some more thought. I'm not sure I agree with that. Hi.
Does this work or no? It works?
Y'all can, I feel like I can't quite hear it, but I think other folks can. Okay.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm Sonia.
Nice to
I'm a
meet you.
sophomore here.
Okay.
Oh.
Just right into it.
Like right into it.
Oh,
okay.
there you go. Yeah.
Okay. Hi, I'm
Hi.
Sonia. I'm a sophomore here, and I'm a psychology major, so that's kind of the background that I'm coming with
Okay.
this, like, I don't know if it's a question or more just like I'm asking for your comments on this.
Sure.
So for me, psychology is the study of study of people's behavior and such, but through a lens of empathy. I believe that when, if you look at it specifically from like a clinical psychology point of view, you're trying to help someone, but with empathy. So even if you don't know what they're going through, you understand that they have struggles and they're relative to their, whatever. So I want to know, like, how you feel about kind of the idea that, like, divide and conquer is the way that, like, the British kind of took over the world, basically. And then now it kind of seems like there's a very informal divide and conquer in the sense that different minorities are kind of pinned against each other. And I think that it kind of made me connect to your idea of kinship and how we can all support each other's kins, or kins that are not our own. So I wanted to know how you feel about that.
Excellent. Thanks, Sonia. Did everyone hear that? Yeah, okay. Thank you for that definition first of psychology. I know nothing about psychology. I'm a humanities person through and through. I did political science as an undergrad. I was at Grinnell, just down in Iowa. I did my political science degree, but since then I've just been pure humanities. I think that this, being able to help somebody with empathy, even if you can't really relate to what they're going through, they're struggling. That's like a basic building block, I would say, to solidarity, very basic from a psychology perspective. And I think, the empathy, you do need empathy, in order to engage in a good faith relation, social relation, with someone who is maybe unfamiliar to you. That seems to be a prerequisite, perhaps, for that type. And so the informal divide and conquer, where it's kind of like a neo-imperialism or something. You're talking about the British Empire and that kind of the formal kind of imperial and colonial tactic of dividing and conquering peoples and, the darker nations, Africa, Latin America, and Asia, when it comes to those particular histories of imperialism. When there is a general sense, a lack of empathy, and instead a sensibility or a common sense of competition or hostility, that obviously breaks down solidarity. And I will say it happens a lot. A really crass way of saying it, I'm just reflecting on the things I hear from other people in the movement. It's, what do people call it in the crass way? The oppression Olympics. Oppression Olympics, particularly within the racial hierarchies that animate the U.S. Settler nationalism and kind of U.S. white supremacy, those configurations. And that the prevailing neoliberal practice of recognition really foments that. It creates a sense of competition for recognition from underrepresented groups or groups that have been historically and continue to be egregiously oppressed and repressed by the United States. And so the recognition part, right, whether it's giving someone from an underrepresented group a position of power, like within the government, or an apology, reparations, land back, I don't know, some type of like trying to repair some sort of justice for the wrongs that have been committed by the United States against various groups. I think that the whole practice of recognition helps to really create that. And it's not just about the formal thing itself, but it's like politics work is a common sense, right? Politics is like the thing we kind of all agree on is what we're supposed to be doing, even like subconsciously in a way. This is how liberalism operates, first of all. Liberalism operates in the United States much more powerfully and in a sneaky way than it does in other places. And so it operates kind of through this common sense of how we're supposed to be going about this thing of politics or this thing of knowledge production. And so a lot of Indigenous scholars have written about, over the last 15 to 20 years, about how the institution of recognition, whether it's for boarding school, the violence of boarding in residential schools, or the healing of trauma, this kind of thing that the state is trying to heal, Indigenous trauma, it creates this mechanism in our minds where we're seeking recognition from the state. And that move means that it's not really about solidarity, right? It's about the relationality, or the axis of relationality is with this here. And solidarity needs to be not here, but it needs to be here between, right? An equal relation, I would say. And so with Indigenous folks, what happens a lot is we are trying to seek recognition from the state, whether it's restitution or justice or an apology or inclusion. Diversity inclusion is a huge neoliberal industry related to the regimes of recognition that have come to dominate how we redress historical oppression in the United States. But solidarity needs to happen, I think, between kind of like everyday people who are really struggling and populate the movements that I'm talking about. And I find, even though there's a lot of misunderstanding between different communities, historically oppressed communities or currently oppressed communities, I feel like the empathy, when we like turn our access of relationality here, and we're not really seeking recognition from each other, but we have a sense of solidarity. It's kind of like we bypass this whole industry and we're able to have relationships with each other based upon those experiences and those conditions that we share. And I'm always sort of thinking about how does my work and how does my sort of presence within the movement or the words that I speak, right, allow us to have a stronger relationship and a bond, almost like at I guess grassroots level would be a better way to put it, than even in institutions, or certainly kind of like looking to the looking to the United States as the center of redress. I'm interested in people like creating that justice with each other, I guess, from the ground up, as that kind of like radical act of love and solidarity with each other. And I guess in my sense, the divide and conquer, right? You're talking about this informal divide and conquer mentality. It dissolves in that way when we refuse, I don't know, the empty gesture of recognition from the state, and we engage in substantive relationships with each other. Do you see I'm trying to think about the difference. I'm not sure if that's entirely correct, the way that I'm kind of pitting them against each other, thinking about them in a different way, but that's often what I'm working through in my mind. A lot of these things are me thinking through things out loud in front of you. We have about 5 minutes left, yeah? Hi.
Hello. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So my name is Zainab, and I'm currently taking a bunch of courses for my urban studies requirement.
Cool.
And so I'm currently taking a metro analysis course, and we're currently in the we're currently in the section of the curriculum where we talk about social division. And like these past few days, we've been talking about segregation and like modern day segregation. And we've divided like segregation to define where minorities live and where majority lives, which is
Okay.
like white people being the majority and like people of color being the minority. And I don't know where in my mind, but I always assume that like there isn't enough minorities to make up for the white people in our nation. But in that class, I learned that 75% of Americans are white people. And so I feel like after learning that, I was just like really like, oh my God, I'm going to have to interact with white people to like, you know what I mean, to be part of the society. Because it's like, I don't know, me and my friends at least, we like, all my, you know what I mean, like minority with minority, like we have this community of care, we have this kinship and all that whatnot.
Yeah.
And so it's like, I think like in my classes, I recognize that I interact with white people, but like I do it in an academic setting where we're only discussing the topics
Sure.
and we're not discussing each other. Like
Sure.
I don't ask my classmates, how are you doing, or anything like that, because
Sure.
I'm like in survival mode. As soon as I enter the classroom, I'm like, get as much curriculum information you can get out of it and like leave. And then if you have to connect and make it on an academic setting.
Sure.
So how does kinship get cultivated in,
Ah.
yeah, I guess that's my question, in these environments?
Good question. So, and a very honest question. Thanks for being real. So we have 3 minutes left. I'll make it quick. I can be long-winded. So this is the other thing that happens with the politics of recognition, which has come to kind of dominate the horizons of decolonization for Indigenous nations, I would say over the past 1 to 2 decades in the US and Canada, is that we're always just tied in knots about how to appeal to kind of like a white settler liberalism, actually, because that's where that recognition comes from. And so whether it's a nonprofit, you know, that might give us money to like save the land from uranium extraction or something like that, I feel like we're always just tripping over ourselves, I think, to appeal to that type of solidarity. And I'm just not as interested in that anymore as I am in relating to Black folks, you know, and migrant and refugee communities, because listen, the only reason why 75% of US citizens probably self-identify as white is because of settler colonialism, okay? Erasure had to happen in order for that type of population domination to happen. And so if you understand that that exists because of settler colonialism and white supremacy as institutions that are essential and indispensable to the project of US nationalism and imperialism, then you're like, okay, well, I can think about whiteness as a structure, right? And as a structure and a system that underwrites this violence, this incredible violence that, let's say, Indigenous folks and Black folks, I'll just talk about 2 populations, experience. I think it helps us to think more and to feel more about the choices we make about who we want to be in relation to. Because I will say, and that's the thing, solidarity isn't just like this blanket thing. I'm not like out here just saying hi to everybody, like, you know, in solidarity all the time. I say in the piece, you know, in order to like have true solidarity, you have to acknowledge that Indigenous people are colonized. We are colonized nations. You can't just tell me you love me and not acknowledge that and then do something about that. That's not real solidarity. It's just not, because that's like a fact. That's a fact. That's a fact for Indigenous nations. We are actually colonized. We have not decolonized because we are still occupied by the United States. In a very, like quite literally, legally, we are occupied by the United States. And so you can make that being the mode, right, of kinship that is operating in your mind, you can make choices about the types of relationships and who you enter into relationship with and what you feel is most productive for your larger goals of decolonization or liberation or freedom or equality, right, that you might be striving for. And that you can assert that there should be certain types of accountability in place, right? Solidarity requires real accountability as well. And so those are just some of my reflections on that. Again, solidarity is imperfect, but it's necessary. That's what's really frustrating about it. It's necessary, but it's really, really hard. And sometimes you just don't want to do it because sometimes it's just too hard, and I get it. But you can also make choices about where you turn that axis of relationality and solidarity. And there are going to be areas where it's really productive for a certain period of time, and then you hit a roadblock. And you can sometimes shift and try solidarity with another group of people or with another kind of political ideology or a group. And I would encourage you all to explore the different axes of solidarity and relationality. If you're just in one and you're like, this is really incomplete and I get really frustrated, it's okay to think outside of that, right? Because the Indigenous approach to solidarity, like I said, it's an entire universe of relationality. It's not just all human. Human beings are super frustrating. You know, you can go out to the river and give an offering to the river here, like people have been doing for millennia, and engage in a form of solidarity with the river, because the river is sacred, right? The river feeds us. And so really just trying to think in an expansive sense, but never lose the accountability that you must have, right? To those people you're in solidarity and relationship with. Empathy is important, but so is accountability. And I'm talking about like a political accountability to self-determination, to abolition, right? To Indigenous sovereignty, to upholding the lives and the value of LGBTQ people. Those types of things, you can never let those go when you're engaging in solidarity. So that's all what I have to say, and we're 2 minutes over. Thank you very much, everyone.